All right. Thank you, Manaswita, for the introduction. Thank you also to Rial for having me today. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm just very excited to be talking about my research today. And the title of my presentation is Designing the Collaborative Referencing Intervention, the Theoretical Framework, Clinical Outcomes, and Research Considerations. So before I begin, I'd like to just give you a brief background of how my research really was started. So my research interests grew from my experiences as a student clinician back in India, where I was a student clinician doing my undergraduate program as well as my master's program. And that's where I got to see many patients with aphasia. And one of the things that I noticed when I was discussing clinical progress with my patients with aphasia is that, I used to come up with the test reports and talk about how much progress they've made in therapy with the clients, with their families. And the most common response that I really got from most of them was that those scores didn't really mean a lot to them because it didn't really impact their everyday life. Their life was still the same since they'd had the stroke. So that kind of bothered me. And, I started questioning the treatments that I was really providing to all of these clients. And so I decided to start my PhD program with that particular question in mind. And very soon, I realized when I started delving more into the literature of aphasia, I realized that my clinical experiences were consistent with what is documented in the literature. And that is that there is a gap between the clinical improvements that we see as clinicians and the functional outcomes that the patients see in their everyday lives. And so this is a big cause for concern because the everyday communication of patients, if that is poor, that may be affecting their participation in everyday activities and also affecting their overall quality of life. So my overarching goal of research is really to bridge this clinical functional gap in aphasia and also in other acquired neurogenic communication disorders. So when the World Health Organization proposed the ICF framework back in 2001, there was a strong push to develop treatments and interventions that looked beyond the body functions or the impairments. So focusing more on activities and participation or the environmental factors or other personal factors. And so when that framework was proposed, there were many treatments that were developed that could be classified under social approach or a psychosocial approach or even functional approach. Direct conversation therapy, conversational coaching, partner training, group therapy are some examples that could potentially fall under these approaches. And these treatments definitely targeted goals that were beyond impairments, that looked at the other components of the ICF. And these treatments also had good empirical evidence in terms of their positive impacts of treatments. For example, people liked these treatments. They reported improved socialization after having received these treatments. And families felt supported through these treatments. However, the theoretical framework for learning about of these treatments, about what is the therapeutic mechanism, or how does learning really occur within this particular treatment approach, was probably missing from many of these treatment methods. So I was then introduced to a novel intervention called the collaborative referencing intervention, which has now become a core area of my research. So the collaborative referencing intervention is originally derived from the barrier task or referential task experiments that were mainly conducted in psychology. So they studied how speakers make meanings within interactions. And Clark was an experimental psychologist who conducted such experiments mainly on college students who were strangers to one another. And so these referential tasks included two participants who both sit facing each other with a numbered board in front of them and a full opaque barrier that separates the two participants. And both the participants are given 12 abstract Chinese shapes called tangrams, as you can see in this particular picture over here. And one of the participants is assigned to be a director, and the other is assigned to be a matcher. So the director arranges these 12 Chinese tangrams on their numbered board and describes their locations to the matcher, who has to match those pictures to the same locations. So when all the 12 pictures are placed, it is then considered to be the end of one trial. And then the accuracy of placements of individual pictures is checked so that the boards, the two boards, really need to match in the end. And then at the end of the trial, the trials are repeated again for a total of 6 times in a session. And these are done in order to assess the changes in referencing patterns of the directors and the matchers across different trials. So on neurotypical adults, Clark found that the pairs who were strangers to each other developed labels or references for these cards. And these references or referential expressions became shorter as the trials were repeated. And the collaborative effort between the two participants also reduced. And that could mean that the time taken for the pair to complete a particular set of card placement reduced across trials. And the number of words or number of turns that the participants took to complete a card placement also reduced across trials. So as you can see in the transcript that I've provided over here, this is from the Clark study. The referential expression on trial 1 that you see, the person says, okay, the number 7 looks like sort of like an angel flying away or something. It's got 2 arms. And I'm not sure which picture they're referring to, perhaps the one on that's C over here. But that's the referential expression that this individual used in the very first trial. And when the same card was played for the next 6 trials, the referential expression seems to have shortened, and the number of words that they have used have also, has also kept reducing. And then in the final trial, the 6th trial, the only expression they have is the angel, and that's it. So that was the research paradigm, the referential task as it was used in psychology. And so researchers in CSD were interested to study the referential tasks in individuals who have cognitive communication disorders. However, these referential tasks had to be adapted to better serve this population. So they reduced the length of the barrier from a full opaque barrier to a partial barrier so that the pairs could see each other's faces for multimodal communication, but were still not able to see the boards of one another or the pictures of each other. And then instead of selecting stranger pairs like they did in psychology, they selected routine communication partners or significant others, or in some cases, clinicians, to serve as the partners for these tasks in order to increase their motivation to complete the task and to also just have fun with the task. And finally, the participants were asked to alternate their roles of being a director and a matcher, so that the pairs really got equal opportunities to develop those references. So these were some of the adaptations that were done to the referential tasks before it was implemented in individuals with cognitive communication disorders. So when the adapted referential task was conducted in individuals with aphasia, amnesia, and early stage Alzheimer's disease, surprisingly, the results on collaborative referencing was similar to that of the neurotypical adults, despite their communication impairments. That is, there was robust learning of references, that is the time taken reduced across trials. Referential expressions became shorter, and the collaborative effort was also reduced, meaning the number of words and the number of turns taken also reduced across trials. Now I have an example here. There are two videos. These are from Mr. Depot is the pseudonym for this particular individual. He's a person with chronic aphasia, chronic Broca's aphasia. He's doing the referential task with Martha, who is the clinician. And this particular data is actually from a treatment session, which I will be presenting later, but I'm only using this to demonstrate successful referencing here today. So let's watch this first one.
Start of the project on number 1.
No. And see the Lauren and the Drew Chris.
Perfect. Now that little thing at the bottom, it's got the Disney logo. Was that on the trip?
Yes.
Oh, how neat. Okay, so Lauren in the blue dress on number 2.
To Bill and Ron Fire.
Okay, Bill and the bonfire on number 3.
Let's see. Mom and Rachel in the Christmas Passports. Mom and the Christmas Passports.
Christmas present, yeah. What's your mother's name?
Let's see. Wilma.
Wilma?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Okay, so that particular video was from one of the earlier sessions. I believe it was session 2. And as you can see, Mr. Depot has been successful in communicating or coming up with expressions about the pictures to Martha, but he's struggling. He uses some multimodality to communicate. This next video is from a later session, I believe session 13. And let's see how he does.
The people in the West Wall.
West Wall. Okay.
The line looks Cameron in the 3C glasses.
She has 3D glasses.
The silliness picture.
Silliness picture.
there we go. Like I said, this was a later session, and those referential expressions came more easily to him, and they seem to be sharing this common ground where Martha definitely knows what Mr. Depot is talking about, and leads to immediate and correct card placements. And Mr. Depot is also perhaps using lesser number of words to Martha about those pictures. Okay. So apart from successful referencing that we just saw, researchers also found that these participants with communication disorders demonstrated more complexities during the task that was not previously accounted for in psychology. So those complexities included the participants' ability to personalize the labels based on both personal and shared knowledge with the partner, rather than standard dictionary words. And participants were using varied modalities, like you just saw with Mr. Depot's use of his phone as an AAC device, and also various resources to communicate with each other. And participants demonstrated really striking use of diverse discourse practices, including sharing personal stories and humor, and also just using language really creatively throughout the task. And so I have two more examples that particularly demonstrate the varied discourse practices. And this, in this video, again, you see another individual with aphasia. His pseudonym is Mr. Bear. He has mild anomic aphasia. And this is again, Mr. Depot with severe Broca's aphasia. And this is Martha in both the videos, even though her hair color is different in both. Okay.
I know which one it is.
Yeah, I know. Here's the group, and we're on the bus to Tijuana. Actually, we were right now when we took it. We were at San Diego,
Okay.
on getting ready to go to Tijuana. And this is our IASP convention with the group here.
So do you get to see them very often, or was it just?
No, we don't. We used to all the time. We'd see Gerald, the first one on the right, but then Al, we don't see him much now. He's really retired now, and he's more politician right now. Actually, so is Gerald too, but Al really is.
So the picture of the party bus to Tijuana shouldn't get out, or Al's political career.
Yeah, pretty bad.
Right.
Best.
Okay, so the party bus to Tijuana on number 10.
Right.
Okay.
Number 11.
So that was Mr. Bear and Martha. Now this is Mr. Depot.
Yes. The silliness table.
That's a great one. The silliness table. That looks so good right now. I think some milk and some donuts is exactly what we need. The silliness table, that's perfect. Okay.
So there you see, lots of stories, lots of humor despite the severity of aphasia. And this is something that was not really found in the referential task experiments done on neurotypical adults. These people were actually having fun with it. They were sharing stories, and they were also like using words that were more creative, more playful, And those kind of demonstrated the complexities of the particular task itself and the way the task was designed. So that was a striking new finding that was documented. So the researchers were inspired from the successful findings that they found, including the robust learning of references that happened in people with aphasia, amnesia, and even in Alzheimer's disease. People were able to participate in meaningful communication, and that was another important finding as well. And the natural way in which the task created multiple opportunities for meaningful referencing, as opposed to repetition, like a drill-based repetition. And also the opportunities that the task provided in terms of using diverse discourse practices, in terms of narratives or playful episodes. So all of these findings suggested to the researchers that the adapted referential task really had high clinical implications. Therefore, they decided to adapt the collaborative referencing research paradigm as the collaborative referencing intervention. So the adaptation of the collaborative referencing intervention was grounded in some of the following theoretical principles that I will summarize briefly. This distributed theories of cognition and communication. We heard about this in the previous focus aphasia talk from Julie Hengst a couple of months ago. And this particular theory postulates that communication is not really an individual trait or an individual ability, but it is distributed across social cultural activities, across interpersonal histories of participants, and across communicative resources that we use in our everyday communication. So within the collaborative referencing intervention, the focus is not on isolated linguistic behaviors. Rather, it is on the pair's co-creation of references based on their shared socio-historic experiences. And second is the rich communicative environments. This framework is based on neuroscience research that shows animals have positive behaviors and neuroplastic changes after living in complex and enriched environments. So the theory proposes that we design rich communicative environments within our clinical sessions in order to improve the cognitive communicative abilities of individuals who have sustained brain injuries by including complex and optimized activities with voluntary participation from individuals. So again, within the collaborative referencing intervention, what it means to us is that the tangrams, for example, are replaced by the participants' personally significant pictures. So if we are using the referential task as an intervention, we are making it more meaningful by adding personally significant pictures of participants, such as of their wedding or a vacation that's important to them. Also, clinicians are asked to let go of their power and control over the sessions or over the task itself, and really having the clinicians to become a communication partner that can be flexible, that can be supportive, and that can shift roles as and when needed, depending on the needs of the clients. And finally, the situated learning theory. So according to this theory, learning is situated in activities, in contexts, in different cultures, and it is continuous. So what it means to us in the CRI is that it offers, the intervention should offer repeated opportunities for the pairs to use references meaningfully based on the context and thus support learning. And so that was the framework that was used while adapting the referential task as an intervention. So with the completion of the adaptation of CRI and having realized the potential of this treatment, I decided to use Roby's 5-phase model for clinical outcome research to launch a series of studies on CRI and aphasia. So my first study was a phase 1 case study of CRI. And one of the goals of phase 1 studies is to detect the therapeutic effects using case studies. And as for CRI, we had evidence that individuals with aphasia show successful collaborative referencing, and they show language learning within the task. And they also show use of diverse discourse practices within the treatment. But what we did not know was whether CRI has any impact on everyday communicative activities or on the psychosocial well-being of our clients with aphasia. So in my phase 1 case study of CRI, I had one participant, Mr. Lee, who had chronic conduction aphasia. And Mr. Lee completed 15 CRI sessions. So this was the actual intervention sessions. And each of these intervention sessions consisted of 6 trials of referencing. And Mr. Lee was paired with a clinician for the first 10 sessions, and he was paired with his spouse, Mrs. Lee, who you see in the picture, for the last 5 sessions. So this is Mr. and Mrs. Lee. So in this study, along with studying the referencing patterns of Mr. Lee, I regularly assessed Mr. Lee's communicative activities using a patient report measure. And for that, I adapted the CAPA, the conversation analysis profile for people with aphasia, to document the conversation style and profile and how it changes across the study. And I also regularly assessed Mr. Lee's confidence as part of his psychosocial well-being using the communication confidence rating scale for aphasia. So here is an example of the adapted CAPA. So it consisted of yes or no questions about styles of conversation, about people that he spoke to, about the situations, the communicative situations that he was in, and the kind of topics that he spoke about. And so his yes or no responses were recorded, and the scores or his responses based on whether they were positive or negative, we plotted them on a graph. And so here's the conversation profile, the adapted CAPA scores, and this shows that we recorded them before the start of the treatment and also at the end of the treatment, and also during treatment, we recorded them every week or after every 3rd treatment session. And so his reports indicated that there were positive changes happening in his communicative activities, which was a very successful finding for us. And then we also looked at the communication confidence rating scale, and this was also measured repeatedly. And as you can see, his reports indicate that his confidence seemed to be increasing across the study and even in follow-up. So for this exploratory study that we had as a phase 1, we found successful referencing. We did find an impact of CRI on Mr. Lee's communicative activities as he reported on the patient report scale, and the same for increased communication confidence as well. So our next step was to plan a phase 2 study. And phase 2 studies typically are designed to make preparations for a clinical trial by exploring the early indications of the efficacy of presence of efficacy and magnitude of efficacy. So it can be considered a pre-efficacy study. So we needed a measure to assess the treatment efficacy of CRI. So we decided to study if the within task referential learning that we have seen over and over again in multiple patients with aphasia. So we wanted to study if the within task referential learning can be generalized to a standard clinical naming task. So I designed the phase 2 research as a mixed methods design with a multiple probe single case experimental design and an interpretive case study design. So the purpose of introducing multiple probe single case experimental design was to implement an experimental control, which was missing in the phase 1 research. So with the multiple probe design, which is similar to a multiple baseline design, except that the onset of treatment is staggered for different participants, and the baseline does not have to be multiple for the consecutive participants in order to avoid learning effects during the baseline phase. So I recruited 4 participants with aphasia, as you can see in the picture here. We have Miss C and Mr. Bear, who both of them had mild anomic aphasia. They're all in their chronic stages. And Mr. David and Mr. Depot both have about moderate to severe Broca's aphasia and also in their chronic stage. And they were all paired with a clinician partner. And so all 4 participants attended 27 sessions that included 2 pre-treatment sessions, 5 baseline, 15 treatment sessions, which was the CRI, and 5 maintenance sessions. As for materials involved, I basically used personally significant pictures from all the participants. So there were 30 referencing targets or 30 topics. And I asked each participant to provide at least 4 photos that belonged to each topic, making a total of 120 pictures per participant. And out of those 120, we used 60 as probe cards and 60 as treatment cards. So they were essentially referring to the same target, but they had different views or different perspectives of the target picture. And the probe cards were used for the naming task, which was our dependent variable, and the treatment cards were used during the treatment itself. Apart from the photographs, I also used other materials like the barrier and the numbered playing boards that was required. So for the dependent variable, we carefully designed a naming task called collaborative confrontation naming task. In this task, the researcher produced 12 probe cards, one after the other, and asked the person with aphasia to come up with a name for each card. And the clinician was instructed to give opportunity for the target participant to label the card first and to suggest a label only if he fails to do so or if asked for help. And examples included our wedding or my grandson at the beach. All of those are considered as appropriate CCN labels. And so these CCN tasks were conducted during each baseline, treatment probe, and maintenance sessions. So there were 5 in each of these phases. So all the CCN responses were video recorded for analysis, and we adapted the PICAS multi-dimensional scoring system to score these CCN responses. And the scores ranged from 1 being no response and all the way to 15 for a complete, accurate, responsive, and immediate response to the probe card. And so 2 independent raters scored each CCN task for all the participants with aphasia. And as for the independent variable, this is the collaborative referencing intervention. We had 15. We provided them 2 to 3 days in a week, and each session was about 60 to 90 minutes long. And there were 12 treatment cards in each session, and the roles of the director and matcher was alternated for each trial. And there was a partial barrier in between. And the naming probes or the CCN tasks were conducted after every 3rd CRI session during the treatment phase. So the CCN scores were plotted on a graph. And as you can see, we did a visual analysis and a statistical analysis. And on visual analysis, we found the treatment scores improved for each participant as soon as the treatment was introduced. We see that for Ms. C, we see that difference for Mr. Bear, for Mr. David, and for Mr. Depot. We found that the treatment mean for all 4 participants was significantly different from the baseline mean for all participants. And there was a baseline trend only in Ms. C. We would like the baseline to be flat, but Ms. C's did show a trend, but we did use a baseline trend correction for Ms. C. And there was also immediacy of effect in all participants, and there was no overlap of data across the phases for any of the participants. And on statistical analysis, we found that the overall treatment effect size, or the tau u, was found to be 0.92, indicating a significant change in treatment from baseline, suggesting that the treatment may be efficacious for these participants. Further, we did a fidelity assessment. We included a procedural fidelity to assess the implementation of the CCN probes, as well as the treatment fidelity to assess the implementation of the treatment itself. And we did that using 2 rating scales that were scored by 2 trained raters who scored all the CCN tasks in the probes, and who scored all of the treatment, well, some of the 12 random CRI sessions for treatment fidelity. And we got 100% mean fidelity score for both. And we also conducted a social validity assessment by conducting interviews with participants with aphasia, caregivers, as well as the clinician partners. And we also did a thematic analysis of their responses. And some of the things that were a highlight from these interviews were that under social significance of goals, one of the participants said, well, one of the caregivers, Mrs. Bear, said he was very motivated because he got to talk about his kids and his job as a school principal. Importance of the effects, Mrs. Depot says he spoke about complex issues like global warming with his grandson. Practicality of the procedure, Mrs. Depot says, we have started playing this game at home. He pulls up a picture on his phone and describes it, and I have to guess it. And the clinician partner also says, very practical, and it is cost effective. It's not just real life goals. Activities are also like real life. So overall, we got highly positive comments under the social validity assessment, which was fantastic. So these successful findings are now actually published in AJSLP. So for more details, you can definitely refer to the article. So with that successful research of my phase 2 study, I conducted another phase 2 study of CRI, which was a replication and an extension of the 2021 study. And the purpose of this particular study was to strengthen the CRI evidence with replication and to improve the external validity, and also to develop more meaningful outcome measures, mainly with respect to conversations. So I recruited 3 new participants with aphasia who all completed 15 CRI sessions, which was the independent variable. And they completed the collaborative confrontation naming task as the dependent variable. And in addition, we added a conversation probe as another dependent variable to assess the impact of CRI on conversations. And the analysis for this study is currently still ongoing, and I'm really looking forward to what I find. So additionally, I have also submitted a research proposal to the ASH Foundation to conduct another phase 2 study of CRI, again, as a way to prepare for a clinical trial by identifying appropriate outcome measures for both assessing conversations as well as quality of life in aphasia. And still waiting to hear back about this proposal. So advancing my line of research on collaborative referencing, the intervention was traditionally designed as a one-on-one intervention. So I'm currently exploring the feasibility and benefits of a multi-party CRI or a group CRI. And considering the design of the CRI, it lends itself very easily to a group setting, providing more opportunities to reference and to share stories. And thus, I anticipate successful learning as well within a group setting. So this particular project is funded, and I'm hoping to start the data collection soon this semester. So next steps for this line of research is for me to conduct a multi-center phase 3 clinical trial to investigate the treatment efficacy of CRI for aphasia. I'm planning a submission for funding soon. I'm also looking for potential data collection sites and collaborations. So please get in touch with me if you're interested. And if all goes well, in the near future, I will also be beginning to think about phase 4 research. So knowledge translation, implementation. So having completed the efficacy study, I would be looking at the effectiveness and considering the steps for implementation within clinical settings and community settings. And these are my references. Any questions? So stop sharing.
That was great. Such an excellent line of work. Okay, let's wait for questions. Does anybody have specific questions? Okay.
Can I? Hi, Suma. I think this is a really impressive line of research you're got going here, and your study design to me seems really defensible as single case studies go. So I think you're on really solid ground here. Something I've heard from folks about collaborative referencing kinds of approaches is that, like on a superficial level, it seems in some ways quite similar to things like constraint-induced language therapy. I don't know if you've ever thought about this or you've heard about it. If you just look at just look at the kind of the surface behaviors, you have people interacting and they don't use a barrier in CILT, but participants have cards. But there's something about that that doesn't quite sit right with me. And as somebody who knows more about CRT, maybe you can, you have a perspective and you can articulate it. How is this different from something like CLIT, which superficially they look quite similar?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you said superficially they do look similar in terms of the task itself, perhaps. But I think I always go back to the theoretical framework that was used to adapt this psychological experiment, really, as an intervention, and the motivation that, or the principles and the support from the theories really is different, I guess, from the theories that is backing up the CILT. And I think that's one of the big things that I always go back to, is the situated theories that we use, the rich communicative environments. We are not imposing any constraints within this intervention, apart from the barrier, which is a part of the game, and is not really a constraint as such. We are actually encouraging participants to use multimodality as opposed to verbal only. We are giving more credit to successful communication as opposed to verbal only communication. So I think there are a lot of ways in terms of the thought put behind designing the intervention, I think is theoretically different.
Yeah, and I think what might land up happening is there are elements of CRI that kind of appear in constraint-induced aphasia therapy, sort of inadvertently, right? They, folks who are doing that are setting up a situation, but it seems as though you're more aware of the theory and the underpinnings. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Could I jump in here? I can't help but jump in on that one. That was a great question, Brent, and I loved your answer, Suma. Another way, using the words you used, another way to think about it is the goal of the CRI is to engage with the patient in successful gameplay. That's it. It is not targeting linguistic forms or patterns of production. It is targeting, referencing targets. In other words, whatever it is the patient wants to be able to talk about. And it recognizes this collaboration over time that Suma talked about. It recognizes that when we reference things, we often say them differently at different times for different reasons. So we're not looking for the repetition of a particular form. And so I think I think Suma is absolutely right. If you don't hold on to what the theoretical aim or goal here is, what it supports, we are so well trained to do more formal tasks that we will slip back into that because we have to be able to do that for formal assessments, but this is not a formal assessment. So I really like that question.
And as an outsider and somebody who's never done CRI or CIAT, it just seems as though there's more respect for human creativity in CRI. And so we don't have these kind of predetermined goals of where we're going. The goal is to be able to communicate, right? And and so whatever you can use in the moment. And so you have respect for a small community, 2 people, over time, developing this reference system. And there are no more parameters placed on it than that. And so, lots of people have talked about how people with aphasia are actually really good and really creative at finding ways of being communicative, despite the fact that they face these obstacles. And so sometimes maybe the best thing we can do as clinicians is just to step out of the way and let them do their thing, right? Or set up an environment where it's possible for them to understand this. And so, yeah.
Absolutely, hence the rich environment. We're setting up the environment and being the kind of partner that optimizes their ability to use their creativity to get better. We can't fix them, they have to fix themselves. So very nice.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to track the chat. So Julie Griffith had the same question, and she asks, how will group CRI be different, similar to CIAT. And so I'm going to move on to the next one. Satyapal says, wonderful presentation. I would like to know how early we can start this intervention, as most of your participants were chronic.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's one of my other aims, is to start thinking about acute stages of aphasia and to see what type of effects we might find. And really thinking about, theoretically, if you're thinking about the intervention, I think the findings should be similar to what we have seen in chronic patients. But we don't know that yet. We haven't done the research yet on acute stages. We have 1 or 2 clinicians who have implemented the intervention in acute stages, and they've told us that it was successful. But I think the next step is definitely to extend this to acute populations and see what the results will be.
Perfect, thank you. And then Dr. Leora Cherney asks, and this is actually related to a question I had, could CRI and its goals be achieved without using a barrier? And I'm just going to piggyback my question off of that. You mentioned about the idea of multi-party CRI. And so in that kind of a situation, what do you think about removing the barrier, and how do you think that would work?
Yeah, I think in one of the social validity interviews that I presented, one of the participants or their spouses talked about how they implemented this CRI at home as a game, and it was fun. And there have been several such reports where people tend to do similar activities while they are driving. They try to describe something that they see, and the spouse has to guess what the person was saying. So I think there's several ways in which you can really recreate the same task without a physical barrier. And another way to think about this is, how do we do this electronically or in telehealth? And Jennifer, I know, has been trying to do that at her university with her students and clients as well. So I think the physical barrier, the presence of the physical barrier, I don't know if that has as much importance as it has to do with people trying to create this common ground with each other and trying to describe what they want to say and try to come to a common ground. And I think referencing is something that we do every day in conversations, when we are like right now, when I'm trying to tell something to you and you don't know what I'm saying. So there is a sort of a barrier, an invisible barrier. So I think referencing is something that we do every day. So regardless of the presence of the physical barrier.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, Bree says, is CRI something that could be done acutely given methodology? So it is related to Satyapal's question. Jennifer writes, I have been using CRI, and the barrier prevents participants from defaulting to following gaze as the primary communicative modality. We all orient to the principle of at least effort. This allows CRI to generalize to authentic conversation when you're not looking at a shared referent, which I agree. And then Julie Griffith adds, please forgive me if I missed this information. What conversational and quality of life measures have you decided to focus on your next phases, and why?
That's a good question. And that has been the hardest challenge for me, has been to identify outcome measures, especially for conversations, to be able to detect changes in conversations, considering how complex and how many variables there can be when we are trying to analyze conversational samples of these individuals. And I didn't even have a same topic. I didn't have a set topic for my conversational probes. So they were just varied. They talked about several different things, and it was so hard to find something to hang on to across samples. So at this point, we are looking at CIUs for conversations. So not the traditional CIUs, but I believe Marian Lehman has worked on a CIU conversation and a new measure. So I'm trying to look at that to see if there can be any changes. We're also trying to look at some of the other discourse, like a novel discourse analysis measure. For example, there's conversational moves that Brent has been working with, and Gloria Olness has been working on. And that is mainly looking at speech functions of turns that people take and trying to categorize different moves as an opening move or a continuing move or a repair move, and to see how that could potentially indicate people's participation in conversation or changes in participation in conversations. So we are exploring a couple of different measures and hoping one of them, or at least the fact that we are using these multiple measures, might actually give us a better sense of what's changing in the conversations. And as for quality of life, we are using a couple of rating scales. The ASHA QCL, the SAQOL are a couple of ones that we've selected so far.
Perfect. Thank you. We have 2 more minutes. I want to take the last question. Our Poland, I'm sorry, I don't know the first name, but she asked, what instruction do you give the partner, example, the family members? How much does the conversational role of the partner impact the participants' responses and outcomes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I really like it because as a new clinician, when I was starting to learn to do this intervention, I had a hard time understanding my own role as a clinician. And so again, going back to the theories here, the role of the communication partner in this intervention, be it a clinician or anybody else, is really to be a communication partner and nothing else. So you really need to take off your clinician hat and not be providing cues or not be jumping in and filling in the word or doing the traditional clinician things that you would do in order to add complexity to the task and be supportive and be flexible. And so I think that is one of the biggest education or training that I would give to the clinicians who are being the partners.
Thank you so much.
There was another part to that question.
It's Jennifer and Dr. Cherney thanking you for a great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
All right, well, we have no further questions. So thanks again, Dr. Devanga, and for everybody joining in. This video will be uploaded shortly. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.